She threw my 3 knitted sweaters to the floor, screaming that her baby will only wear designer clothes and that my gift was an embarrassment. I am Sarah, 68 years old. I live alone downtown. I never imagined that my silence would cost her her entire inheritance. The event hall that my daughter Valerie had rented for her baby shower looked like it was taken out of a pretentious decorating magazine. Everything was covered in balloons and cream gold, and a pale green that she insisted on calling imperial mint. Tables were draped in fine linen. Floral arrangements cost more than what most families earn in a month. And a tower of French macarons stood untouched because nobody dared ruin the aesthetic. I sat in one of the corners, watching the spectacle with a mix of curiosity and exhaustion. For 40 years, I owned a haberdashery called the Golden Scissor. Behind that oak counter selling mother-of-pearl buttons, silk ribbons, zippers, and the finest yarn in the city, I built my life. With the constant ring of my cash register and the sharp edge of my stork-shaped embroidery scissors, I paid for Valerie's private education. I gave her a life of comfort I never had in my youth. But somewhere along the way, my daughter confused honest hard work with a lack of class. To her, manual labor became a symbol of poverty, and my shop an uncomfortable reminder of her roots. Valerie sat on a velvet armchair in the center of the room, surrounded by her friends. They all wore designer dresses, high heels, and rehearsed smiles. Her husband, Stephen, a man who worked at a bank and always looked down his nose at me, stood beside her, holding a glass of champagne and nodding at whatever the guests said. The time to open gifts had arrived. The room filled with exaggerated gasps every time a box bearing a European brand logo saw the light of day. "Oh, Valerie, look how beautiful," one of her friends squealed, holding up a tiny wool coat bearing the emblem of an Italian fashion house. "Your baby is going to be the most elegant in the city." Valerie smiled, pleased, rubbing her swollen belly with one hand while receiving greeting cards with the other. I waited my turn in silence. On my lap was a box wrapped in brown craft paper, tied with a real silk ribbon I had saved in my shop for over 2 decades. Inside rested 3 sweaters I had knitted by hand. It took me 3 months to finish them. I had imported the baby alpaca wool directly from Peru. It was a material so soft, it felt like it melted between your fingers. Hypoallergenic, warm but light, perfect for a newborn's skin. Every stitch, every cable in the design carried my prayers, my hopes, and the deep love of a grandmother waiting for her first grandson. Besides the sweaters, I had left a thick white envelope on the main gift table near the entrance. Inside that envelope was a check. A 6-figure check, meant to open a college trust fund or to put a down payment on a bigger house for the family. It was my real gift, the fruit of my investments of the commercial real estate I bought with the profits from the haberdashery, which Valerie had no idea existed. She always believed I lived on a miserable pension. Finally, one of the event planners took my box and handed it to Valerie. "This is from your mom," the girl said into the microphone with a polite smile. The entire room fell silent. Every eye turned to me. I kept my posture straight, smoothing the skirt of my sober but impeccable dress. Valerie took the box. From the very first second she saw the craft paper, her face tensed. It wasn't the shiny, ostentatious packaging she expected, her fingers adorned with diamond rings. Pulled at the silk ribbon with impatience and ripped open the cardboard lid. The silence in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating. Valerie pulled out the first sweater, an ivory white. Then the second, a soft yellow. Finally, the third, a seafoam green. She held it in the air for a second, like she was holding dirty rags. I expected to see a smile on her face, a flash of recognition for the work, the hours invested, the unmatched texture of the alpaca. But what I saw was a grimace of absolute disgust. Her upper lip curled in repulsion. "Mom," Valerie said into the microphone, making sure every single person in the room heard her. "What is this?" "They are sweaters for your baby, honey," I answered from my seat, my voice clear and calm. "Hand-knitted with the finest wool I could find." Valerie let out a dry laugh, a joyless cackle that bounced off the decorated walls of the hall. She looked at her friends, seeking complicity, and then looked at me with a coldness that froze my blood. "Mom, how embarrassing." Her words sliced through the air like sharpened knives. "This is Itchy. My baby will only wear designer clothes. I am not putting these outdated things on him that look like they were bought at a flea market." And then she did it. She dropped the 3 sweaters to the floor. She didn't set them on the table. She didn't put them back in the box. She threw them on the ground next to her chair like they were trash unworthy of being near the designer gifts. A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Some women covered their mouths. Others looked away uncomfortable. Stephen, my son-in-law, said nothing. He simply took a sip of his champagne and stared at the ceiling, as if the public humiliation of his mother-in-law was none of his business. I sat there, frozen. I felt a blow to my chest, a dull, deep ache that threatened to steal my breath. The little girl whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the one I taught to walk down the aisles of my shop, had just despised me in front of 50 strangers. They expected me to cry. They expected me to stand up in shame, to apologize for not measuring up to her new world of superficial luxury. They expected the submissive, wounded mother. But I am Sarah. I survived widowhood at 30. I built a business in an era when women could barely open a bank account without a man's permission. And I built a solid fortune based on intelligence and calculation. The sadness was rapidly replaced by absolute clarity. As if a veil had been lifted from my eyes, I saw Valerie for who she truly was, an empty, ungrateful woman blinded by vanity. I didn't shed a single tear. I stood up from my chair with a calmness that seemed to unnerve the crowd. My steps didn't falter as I crossed the room. The silence was so tomb-like that you could only hear the sound of my low heels clicking against the marble floor. I reached Valerie. She looked down at me from her seat, lifting her chin in a gesture of childish defiance, waiting for me to beg her to accept the gift or to run crying to the bathroom. I crouched down slowly, never losing my dignity in a single movement. My hands, marked by decades of labor, picked up the white sweater, then the yellow, and finally the seafoam green. I shook off the invisible dust they might have gathered from the floor and folded them with military precision. I placed them back inside the cardboard box and put the lid on. "You are right, Valerie," I said, my voice so quiet it was terrifying. "This is not for you." I didn't wait for her reply. I turned around and walked toward the entrance. As I neared the doors, I passed the large main table where the gift cards and envelopes were stacked. My eyes immediately locked onto the thick white ones sealed on the back with red wax and the lotus flower stamp I use for my personal correspondence. No one had touched it yet. No one knew what was inside. I reached out, picked up the envelope, and slid it into my leather purse. The sound of my purse zipping shut was the final period on my attendance at that party. I walked out of the hall, and the cool afternoon air hit my face. I walked to the main avenue to hail a cab. While waiting on the curb, I hugged the cardboard box against my chest. The alpaca wool was still there, soft and warm, waiting for someone who truly knew how to value it. The cab ride home was silent. I looked out the window as the city lights began to flicker on. My mind was racing, processing every detail of what had just happened. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt like I had just woken up from a very long dream. For years, I had justified my daughter's behavior. I thought her obsession with brands and appearances was just a phase, a way to fit into her husband's social circle. I convinced myself that deep down, she was still the girl who valued hard work and love. But throwing my work on the floor, despising my gift with deliberate cruelty, was crossing a point of no return. The contempt didn't come from ignorance. It came from arrogance. I arrived at my house, a colonial-style property downtown with an inner courtyard full of ferns and bougainvillea that I tended to myself. I double-locked the mahogany door and left the box with the sweaters on the dining table. Then I opened my purse, took out the white envelope, and broke the red wax seal. I pulled out the check. I read it by the light of the lamp. The amount written there represented years of savings, of rent collected right on time, of smart investments. It was money I had destined entirely to make life easier for that new family, to secure my grandson's future. Valerie believed I was an old woman who barely had enough to eat, and I had planned to surprise her tonight, to show her that her mother would hand her the entire world if necessary. I held the check between my index finger and thumb, and with a firm motion I tore it in half, then into quarters, then into eighths. I tossed the pieces into the wastebasket under the desk in my study. I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat in my favorite armchair. The house was quiet, a peaceful, comforting silence. Valerie had said her baby would only wear designer clothes. She had made it clear that my world, my hands, my effort, had no place in her perfect new life. She had drawn a line in the sand with her designer shoes. I took a sip of tea and smiled in the shadows of my living room. If she wanted to live in a world of appearances, I would let her live in it entirely. I had funded her whims for far too long. But today, in that room full of imperial mint balloons, my role as her unconditional provider had ended. I picked up my landline and dialed my lawyer's number. It was late, but I knew he would answer. "Good evening, Arthur," I said when I heard his sleepy voice on the other end of the line. "Sorry for the hour. I need to see you first thing tomorrow morning at your office." "Did something terrible happen, Sarah?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. "On the contrary, Arthur. I just had a wonderful revelation," I replied, staring at the cardboard box on my table. "I need to change my will and restructure all my accounts and properties." I hung up before he could ask any more questions. I leaned back in the armchair and closed my eyes. The poor, outdated old lady Valerie thought I was had just vanished. Starting tomorrow, they would meet the owner of the empire that financed their fantasies. My daughter wanted exclusive brands, and I was about to teach her the true cost of exclusivity. I woke up at 5 in the morning with a clarity I hadn't felt since my youth, back when I used to open the shop before the sun came up. The house was submerged in that silent, cold darkness that precedes the dawn. There was no trace of sadness in my chest. Not a single tear had stained my pillow during the night. Instead of the anguish any normal mother should feel after being publicly humiliated by her only daughter, what ran through my veins was raw electricity, a renewed purpose. I went to the kitchen and brewed a pot of cinnamon coffee just the way I liked it. As the sweet aroma filled the room, I leaned against the tiled counter and mentally replayed every second of yesterday's event. Valerie's grimace of disgust, the dull thud of the 3 alpaca sweaters hitting the floor, the indifferent stare of my son-in-law Stephen, and the complicit silence of all those women wrapped in expensive fabrics. They thought they had witnessed the defeat of a ridiculous old woman. They didn't know they had actually attended the funeral of my patients. With the hot mug in my hands, I walked to my study. It was a small room lined with floor-to-ceiling wooden bookshelves, packed with accounting ledgers, old encyclopedias, and thread catalogs nobody printed anymore. Behind a watercolor landscape I painted 20 years ago hid a wall safe. I set the coffee on the desk and spun the metal dial. 3 to the right, 2 to the left, 4 to the right. The heavy iron door gave way with a heavy click. Inside, there were no family jewels or sentimental relics. There were thick leather binders, manila envelopes, and most importantly, my heavy brass keyring. I took the keyring out and dropped it on the mahogany desk. The metallic clatter echoed in the room like a judge's gavel handing down a sentence. That keyring held the keys to 6 commercial properties located on the busiest avenues in the city. I sat in my swivel chair and began opening the binder. It was time to take an inventory of my power. For decades, I built an invisible empire by selling tiny things. A mother-of-pearl button, an invisible zipper, a yard of velvet ribbon. People looked down on pennies, but I knew that 1,000,000 pennies made a fortune. With the profits from the shop, I bought my first commercial space in the 80s, back when bank managers mocked me for being a widow asking for a loan. Then I bought the second, the third, until I reached 6. The monthly rent from those properties, now occupied by pharmacies, banks, and chain restaurants, generated an income that Stephen and Valerie couldn't match if they worked 3 lifetimes. But the document that interested me the most was in the last red binder. It was the deed to the apartment where my daughter and son-in-law lived. A full floor in the Diamond Tower featuring panoramic views, Carrara marble floors, and private security. Valerie always told her friends that Stephen had bought it with his year-end bonus from the bank. The truth was very different. I had bought it in cash and handed it over to them under a rent-free use agreement, while also covering the monthly HOA fees and property taxes. I was the absolute owner of the walls where she hung her designer paintings. I stood up and walked over to the full-length mirror hanging in the hallway. I studied myself closely. I saw a 68-year-old woman with completely white hair pulled into a flawless bun. Deep wrinkles framed my eyes and lips. I was wearing a simple cotton robe and rubber-soled slippers. I smiled at my own reflection. I understood perfectly why Valerie despised me. Old age is a perfect invisibility cloak in this society. They see us with gray hair and assume our brains have dried up. They see us in orthopedic shoes and comfortable clothes and automatically assume we are useless, that our time has passed, that we are only good for quietly babysitting and baking pies on Sundays. Youth possesses that blind arrogance. They think they invented the world just because they just arrived in it. Valerie had confused my voluntary austerity with poverty. She had confused my tolerant silence with weakness. Because I didn't carry bags with giant gold logos or drive an imported SUV, she assumed my time at the shop had been a shameful failure. It never occurred to her that true wealth doesn't scream. It whispers. And I had been whispering for 40 years. At exactly 8 in the morning, I took off my robe, put on a gray wool tailored suit, applied a touch of cherry lipstick, and left the house. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of Arthur Sterling's firm in the financial district. When I arrived, the secretary sent me right in. Arthur was a meticulous, trustworthy man in his 50s who had handled my legal affairs since his father retired. He greeted me standing up, frowning, a half-finished cup of coffee in his hand. "Sarah, what an early surprise," he said, offering me the leather chair across from his desk. "When you called last night, you sounded very determined. Is everything okay with your health?" "My health has never been better, Arthur," I replied, sitting with my back straight and placing my purse on my lap. "I came to work. I need us to make immediate changes to my portfolio." Arthur pulled out his notepad and looked at me closely, waiting for my instructions. "First, I want to revoke the rent-free agreement for the apartment in the Diamond Tower," I said, my voice steady, without a hint of hesitation. "Starting the 1st of next month, I want a commercial lease drawn up for them. The rent will be current market value, not a penny less." Arthur stopped writing. He looked up, visibly stunned. "But Sarah Valerie and her husband live there. I understand they're expecting a baby. If you charge them market rent in that area, we are talking about an exorbitant amount. Are you sure about this?" "Completely sure," I stated, holding his gaze. "Furthermore, I want you to cancel the automatic payment linked to my account for that building's HOA fees. As of today, that expense falls on the residents." The lawyer blinked, processing the information. He had known my daughter since she was a little girl, and he knew I had always been a protective mother bordering on indulgent. "There's more." I continued, pulling a gleaming platinum credit card from my purse and placing it on his desk. "This is the extension of my credit card that Valerie keeps for emergencies. I want it reported stolen today. Have the bank's central system block it." Arthur stared at the piece of plastic like it was an explosive device. He adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Forgive my overstepping, Sarah, but this is going to financially suffocate them. I know Stephen's salary. He makes good money, but the lifestyle they maintain in that apartment, plus the expenses of a newborn, they won't be able to sustain it without your help. Valerie is going to panic." "That is exactly the plan, Arthur," I said, with a calmness that surprised even me. "Her whole life, my daughter has lived on a glass floor that I have held up with my bare hands. Yesterday, she made it very clear to me that glass isn't enough. She only accepts diamonds. Well, let's see her try to buy her diamonds with her husband's salary." Arthur sighed. As a man of the law, he was used to family drama, inheritance fights, and bitter divorces. But rarely did he see a parent cut the financial umbilical cord with such surgical coldness. "Was there a serious problem, if I may ask?" he asked quietly. "A difference of opinion regarding infant fashion," I replied dryly. "Nothing that should concern you legally. I just need you to ensure all these changes are ironclad. I don't want any room for renegotiation." "I will do it today. I'll draft the lease and send it via certified mail to their residence. The bank will block the card before noon. Is there anything else regarding your personal accounts or your will?" "Yes, the current will is voided. We will draft a new one next week. But for now, I want all my liquid capital, my investment funds, and the properties to be moved into a blind trust managed by you and your firm. If something happens to me tomorrow, Valerie will not have direct access to a single cent in my bank account. Everything she receives, If I decide to leave her anything at all, will be under strict conditions that I myself will dictate." Arthur nodded solemnly. He knew that when I made a decision, no human force could make me back down. I signed a couple of temporary authorizations, stood up, and offered him my hand. "Thank you, Arthur. I trust your speed. Don't worry, Sarah. The notices will arrive shortly. And brace yourself, because your phone is going to ring off the hook." "I don't think so," I smiled faintly. "I plan to unplug it for a few days. I need peace to finish a knitting project I've been putting off." I walked out of the office feeling 10 years younger. The morning sun gleamed off the tall glass buildings in the financial district. As I walked down the sidewalk, dodging rushed executives talking on their latest model phones, my mind finished mapping out what was to come. There would be no screaming, no dramatic confrontations or soap opera scenes. My revenge wouldn't be a vulgar scandal. It would be a silent, cold, systematic execution. I would pull my safety net away, thread by thread, slowly letting gravity do its work. Valerie and Stephen had built a house of cards based on the illusion of their own success. Stephen strutted around at his alumni reunions, bragging about his position at the bank, conveniently leaving out that half his client portfolio existed because I had pulled strings and moved my accounts to his branch so he could collect the commissions. Valerie played the high society trophy wife, throwing baby showers with French macarons, indirectly paid for by the rent from the commercial properties I managed. They were two supporting actors believing they owned the theater. I returned home around noon. The inner courtyard welcomed me with the freshness of its ferns. I went straight to the dining room, where the cardboard box with the knitted sweaters remained exactly where I had left it the night before. I opened the lid and stroked the seafoam green wool. It was so soft, so delicate. I picked up my embroidery scissors, the ones shaped like a stork with the sharp beak, and snipped a tiny rebellious thread sticking out from the collar of the garment. That metallic sound, the snap of the steel blades cutting the thread, gave me a profound sense of satisfaction. The trap was set. All the legal and financial mechanisms had been triggered with a couple of signatures on an oak desk. Now it was just a matter of time. I only had to sit in my armchair, pour myself another cup of tea, and wait patiently for the bubble to burst against the harshness of the real world. The time had come for my daughter to discover that designer brands might dress the body, but they can't pay the bill when the true landlord of life decides to collect the rent. I unplugged the landline cord from my living room wall at exactly 10 in the morning the following day. The little plastic click as it separated from the socket felt like one of the most liberating sounds I had ever heard. In my colonial house, silence began to reign immediately, accompanied only by the distant chirping of the birds nesting in the courtyard. I took the next 48 hours for myself. No rushing, no obligations. I spent my time pruning the dry branches of my bougainvillea with my garden shears, feeling the damp earth between my fingers. For years, my routine had been dictated by everyone else's needs. If Valerie needed someone to sign for a package, I stayed home. If Stephen had a business dinner and they wanted the maid to clean their apartment late, I went over to supervise. I had been the unpaid property manager of their luxury lives. Not anymore. I kept my cell phone on, but on silent, resting on the mahogany coffee table. It was noon on Tuesday when the screen lit up with the first sign that my plan was in motion. It was a push notification from my banking app. I read it while drying my hands with a cotton towel. The message was brief and brutal. Purchase attempt declined. Card ending in 8924 blocked due to report. I smiled faintly and opened the transaction details. The charge attempt came from Little Monarchs, one of the most expensive and exclusive children's boutiques in the financial district's luxury mall. The amount Valerie had tried to run equated to what a minimum wage worker would earn in 3 months of full-time shifts. She was surely trying to buy those tiny onesies with designer logos printed on the chest to compensate for the bad taste my alpaca sweaters had left in her mouth. I pictured the scene with crystal clarity. Valerie at the glass counter, her imported handbag hanging from her forearm, smiling condescendingly at the cashier. Then the annoying beep of the terminal. My daughter's confused look, the nervous smile as she claimed it must be a system error, asking them to run it again. And the second decline. The silent humiliation of having to leave the clothes on the counter and walk out of the store empty-handed, feeling the stares of the other wealthy clients burning into her back. Barely 15 minutes after that notification, My cell phone screen began to flash relentlessly. 1, 2, 3, 5 missed calls from Valerie. Then the text messages came pouring in, dropping one after another like a desperate rain. I didn't open a single one. I left the device on the table and went to the kitchen to make myself some chia lemonade. The second phase of my strategy materialized at dawn on Wednesday. Chloe Arthur's highly efficient assistant sent me a brief text confirming that the certified courier had just delivered the packet of documents to the front desk of the Diamond Tower with a signed receipt from the building's concierge. The hourglass had completely flipped. I knew the blow to the apartment would cause an earthquake in their marriage, but Valerie wasn't the only one who needed a lesson in humility. Stephen, my son-in-law, the man who looked down his nose at me over his champagne glass while his wife trampled on my work, also needed to understand exactly whose ground he was standing on. At 11 in the morning, I dressed in a navy blue linen suit, closed-toe, low heels, and my authentic pearl necklace, which I only wore for business occasions. I hailed a cab and gave the address of the main bank branch, the massive glass and steel building where Stephen worked as a corporate account executive. Stepping through the bank's revolving doors, the air conditioning hit me with its usual chill. The place was packed with people waiting in lines, while in the desk area, executives in spotless suits attended to clients with rehearsed smiles. I spotted Stephen almost immediately. He was sitting in his glass cubicle, gesturing with his hands as he explained something to a young couple who looked at him in admiration. I didn't approach him. I walked right past, marching with a steady pace and my head held high toward the stairs leading to the executive floor. The branch manager's secretary stood up when she saw me. "Sarah, what a pleasure to see you. Is Mr. Harrison expecting you?" she asked, recognizing me instantly. "I don't have an appointment, Margaret, but tell Harrison I need 5 minutes of his time. It's an urgent matter regarding my investment portfolios." Not even 30 seconds passed before the fine wooden door opened, and Harrison, the branch's general manager, stepped out to greet me. He was an older man from my generation who knew exactly the weight of my bank accounts. He led me into his office, a spacious room with leather sofas and a privileged view of the main avenue. "Sarah at your service. How can I help you today?" he asked, offering me a seat and ordering a coffee from his secretary. "I'll be brief, Harrison." I began crossing my hands in my lap. "I have come to sign the necessary authorizations to transfer the entirety of my investment funds, my fixed-term promissory notes and the checking accounts for my commercial rents. Everything will be moved to a blind trust managed by Arthur Sterling's firm at another institution." Harrison's face lost a bit of color. We were talking about moving capital that represented one of the largest accounts at his branch. "But Sarah, was there a problem with our service? If it's a matter of yields, I assure you I can escalate your case to regional management and secure a much more aggressive preferred rate. You are a founding client of this branch." "It's not a rate issue, Harrison. It's a personal asset restructuring," I replied in a polite but final tone. "The instructions are already in my lawyer's hands, and the transfer orders will arrive this afternoon. I only came as a courtesy to notify you in person and to make a very specific request." Harrison nodded, grabbing a pen and a small notepad, trying to salvage whatever he could from the situation. "Whatever you need, ma'am. Until the total transfer is completed in the coming days, I want Stephen, my son-in-law, removed immediately from any access, visibility, or advisory role on my accounts. I know he received bonuses for managing my funds at this branch. That ends today. I demand absolute confidentiality regarding my financial movements." Harrison swallowed hard, suddenly grasping the family dynamic unfolding before his eyes. "It is done this very second. I will log into the system and block his executive profile from your account numbers." "I appreciate it, Harrison. It's been a pleasure doing business with you all these years." I stood up, shook his hand, and walked out of the manager's office. As I walked down the stairs to the main floor, I felt Stephen's gaze burning into me. He had finished with his clients and was standing by his desk, frowning, watching me descend from the management area. I walked toward the exit, but he stepped in my path before I could reach the revolving doors. He was wearing a light gray suit that I knew perfectly well cost more than a car payment, and an Italian silk tie. "Sarah, what a surprise to see you here," he said, forcing a wide smile so as not to draw the attention of his coworkers. "Valerie has been trying to reach you like crazy. Your home phone is busy all the time." "I unplugged it. I needed some peace," I replied, looking him straight in the eyes without breaking my stride, forcing him to walk alongside me. Listen, I'm so glad I caught you, he continued, dropping his voice to a tense whisper. There was a really weird issue with Valerie's credit card extension yesterday, and this morning we got a package from your lawyer. We think Arthur made a massive administrative error. He sent us a commercial lease for the apartment with a ridiculous rent amount and a notice for HOA fees. I stopped in front of the bank's large glass doors. I looked him up and down. I noticed a bead of sweat beginning to form on his left temple right at the hairline. The confident executive was starting to crumble. Arthur does not make errors. He is an excellent professional. I said, my voice soft but entirely devoid of warmth. The rent-free agreement has been revoked. If you wish to continue living in the Diamond Tower, you will have to pay market value just like any other tenant. Stephen blinked several times in disbelief. He looked around, making sure no one in the bank was listening to his mother-in-law charge him rent. Sarah, please tell me this is a joke, he whispered. And this time the fake smile vanished completely. Is this about the sweaters? About the baby shower? For God's sake, Valerie is pregnant. Her hormones have her going crazy. She's hypersensitive. You know how women get in that state. She said something stupid in front of her friends. Yes, but you can't throw us out on the street over a pregnancy tantrum. The cynicism of his words filled me with a mix of disgust and pity. Using his wife's pregnancy as a shield to justify cruelty and arrogance was the move of a coward. No one is throwing you out on the street, Stephen, I answered casually, adjusting my purse on my shoulder. You are successful adults. You are a prestigious banker, and my daughter is a woman with very refined tastes. I am merely withdrawing the subsidy. I am sure that with your talent for finance, paying the rent and maintenance on that apartment will be a minor expense for you. Sarah, the base salary I make here doesn't cover that rent, and you know it. I depend on the commissions and bonuses from the large portfolios. He stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened in horror as he realized the route I had just taken from the manager's office. You didn't go up there to talk to Harrison about my accounts, did you? My accounts, Stephen, have always been mine, and as of today, they are no longer in your portfolio. Have an excellent day at work. I didn't wait to see his full reaction. I turned around, pushed through the revolving doors, and stepped out into the heat of the street. The city air filled my lungs. I left behind a man realizing that the marble floor he had been walking on was actually very thin ice, and it had just shattered beneath his feet. I got back to my house downtown a little before lunch. My trusted housekeeper, Martha, a loyal woman who had worked for me for 15 years, had prepared noodle soup and grilled chicken breast. While I ate at the kitchen table, I pulled out my cell phone and finally decided to listen to the voicemails Valerie had left. I put the phone on speaker on the table. The first message was from Tuesday afternoon. Mom, it's me. Hey, I had a horrible problem at the mall with the card. You embarrassed me so much, seriously. Call the bank and see what happened. The plastic is probably damaged. I'll call you later. The tone was annoyed, demanding, like a boss talking to her employee. The second message from Wednesday morning. Mom, answer the damn phone. What is wrong with Arthur? I just got a disgusting document saying you're going to charge us rent for the apartment. It's my house. Stephen is hysterical. You need to stop this stupidity right now. Her voice trembled with fury. There was no trace of the sophisticated woman from the baby shower. She was a spoiled child who had just had her favorite toy taken away. The third message from barely an hour ago after my visit to the bank. Mom, please. This time Valerie's voice was broken, choking on sobs. Stephen just called me from the office. He told me about your investments. He told me you canceled the card. Mom, we can't pay this. The baby is coming in 2 months. I don't have money for the private clinic. We don't have money for the HOA fees. Please, Mom, forgive me for the sweaters. I was stupid. I'm begging you. Answer me. We're coming to your house. I turned off the phone screen. Silence returned to the kitchen. Martha was looking at me from the sink. She knew the situation perfectly well, but didn't dare say a word. Martha, I said, finishing my soup and wiping the corners of my mouth with a cloth napkin. Make sure the deadbolt on the front door is locked twice. If the doorbell rings this afternoon, do not open it under any circumstances. We are not receiving visitors. Yes, Miss Sarah, whatever you say, Martha replied, nodding firmly, and heading straight down the main hallway to secure the house. I got up from the table and walked to my study. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the spines of my old accounting ledgers. I sat in my armchair, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath. The execution had been flawless. The dominoes kept falling one after another, destroying the fantasy they had lived in at my expense. Valerie had demanded a world of brands, high prices, and exclusivity. Now, for the first time in her life, she was going to discover what it really cost to live in it. And I, from the tranquility of my home, would watch her learn the most important lesson of all, that the hand that weaves the safety net is the same hand that can cut it. The sound of the heavy brass knocker slamming against the mahogany door echoed down the hallway of my house. It was 4 in the afternoon. Sunlight poured through the large windows of the inner courtyard, illuminating the dust particles floating in the quiet air of my living room. "Mom, open the door, please. I know you're in there." Valerie's voice was muffled by the thickness of the front door, but the hysteria in her tone was unmistakable. It was followed by the sound of knuckles rapping desperately against the wood, and then the deeper, tense voice of my son-in-law. "Sarah, we need to talk like adults. This is madness. Open the door." Sitting in my reading chair with my half-moon glasses resting on the bridge of my nose, I turned the page of the history book I was reading. I didn't move a single muscle in my face. A few feet away in the archway connecting to the kitchen, my housekeeper Martha stood holding a dish towel. She stared at me with wide eyes torn between the instinct to go open the door and the strict order I had given her hours earlier. "Ma'am," Martha whispered, taking a couple of steps closer. "They're knocking very hard. The neighbors are going to come out and look." "Let them look, Martha," I replied without lifting my eyes from the book. "The show is free. If you go near that lock, I'll fire you today. Go back to the kitchen and boil water for coffee, please." Martha nodded quickly and vanished down the hall. I closed the book and set it on the coffee table. Hearing my daughter beg from the sidewalk gave me a sense of satisfaction, but it didn't cause me the gut-wrenching pain I would have felt just a few days ago. In my old haberdashery, the Golden Scissor, I learned a basic rule of business. If you give away an extra inch of ribbon to every customer out of pity, by the end of the month, you go bankrupt. With Valerie, I had broken my own rule. I had given her miles of my life, my money and my dignity, and the result was the monster of vanity now kicking at my door. The pounding continued for 20 more minutes. There was crying demands and even a vague threat from Stephen to call a locksmith. An absurd notion, considering the house was in my name. Finally, exhaustion and public shame did their job. I heard footsteps walking away down the sidewalk and the engine of a car speeding off. Silence returned to my home. I picked up my cell phone, which was still on silent, and dialed Arthur Sterling's office. His assistant Chloe patched me through immediately. "Good afternoon, Arthur," I said, my voice serene. "I imagine your switchboard has been quite busy today." "Sarah, you have no idea," Arthur sighed on the other end of the line. "Stephen has called me 8 times, and Valerie left 4 crying voicemails on my machine. They are demanding an emergency meeting. They are arguing that the lease agreement is a mistake and that you are not in your right mind." I smiled faintly at my son-in-law's audacity. "Perfect. Schedule them for tomorrow at 10 in the morning in your conference room. Tell them I will be present to clear up any doubts about my supposed mental issues. And Arthur, please have all the account statements, trust fund balances, and expense projections ready. I want the meeting to be extremely detailed." "Everything is ready, ma'am. I'll see you tomorrow." The next morning, the city weather was gray and threatened rain. I dressed in a fine black wool suit, a silk scarf around my neck, and low heels. Before leaving, I took a small silver brooch shaped like a stork from my vanity, the same one I used as the logo for my haberdashery, and pinned it to the lapel of my blazer. It was a subtle reminder of my origins, of those working hands they so despised. I arrived at Arthur's office 15 minutes early. I sat at the head of the large glass table in the conference room with a cup of black tea in front of me. Arthur sat to my right, arranging 3 thick leather binders on the table. At 10 o'clock sharp, the glass door opened. Valerie and Stephen walked in, and the contrast with the dazzling couple who had starred in the baby shower just days ago was almost comical. Valerie was wearing a designer sweater she looked like she had grabbed in a rush. Her eyes were swollen, her makeup poorly applied. Stephen, the flawless executive, was wearing a suit without a tie, his shirt collar slightly wrinkled, and an expression of suppressed rage. Seeing me, Valerie took a quick step forward, arms wide open, tears welling in her eyes. "Mom, thank God. Mom, please." I raised my right hand, palm flat, facing her, in a sharp gesture that stopped her dead in her tracks 3 feet away. "Sit down, Valerie. We are not in a soap opera. We came to review documents." My daughter blinked, thrown off by the coldness in my voice. She looked at Stephen for support, but he was too busy glaring daggers at my lawyer. They both dragged the heavy leather chairs out and sat across from me. "Sarah, this has gone way too far." Stephen started resting his forearms on the table and trying to use his negotiating banker tone. "I understand you were offended at the party. Valerie made a mistake. The pregnancy hormones have her very sensitive. But trying to charge us market rent for the apartment blocking the cards and removing me from managing your bank accounts is an irrational overreaction. You are putting your grandson's stability at risk." I set my teacup down on the porcelain saucer with a soft clink. I stared at him, letting the weight of my silence flood the room for several seconds. Stephen began to shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Stephen, the only person who has put his family's stability at risk is you, by living a fantasy you cannot afford," I said, my voice so flat and calm it made Valerie let out a muffled sob. "Arthur, please hand them the first binder." The lawyer slid one of the leather binders toward the center of the table. Stephen opened it suspiciously. Inside was a color-printed spreadsheet. "What you have in front of you, Stephen, is a breakdown of your actual income as a bank executive compared to the cost of living you maintain in the Diamond Tower," I explained, crossing my hands on the table. "As you can see, your base salary and your commissions barely cover half the market rate rent that you will have to pay from now on. And that's without counting the HOA fees, the private health insurance Valerie demands, the vacations, the imported designer clothes, and the cleaning staff." Stephen stared at the numbers, and the color drained from his face. He, better than anyone, knew how to read a financial balance sheet. For years, he had conveniently ignored where the money came from that filled the potholes of his lifestyle, assuming the flow of my generosity was infinite and free. "It's my apartment, Mom," Valerie whimpered, clutching her belly. "You gave it to me when we got married. You said it was our wedding gift." "I gave you a rent-free use agreement, Valerie. I never put the deed in your name because deep down, I knew you and Stephen didn't have the financial maturity to maintain a property of that caliber," I replied relentlessly. "Yesterday, you proved that you also lack the moral character to appreciate it. You demand designer clothes for your son, you reject manual labor, and you mock the woman who gave you everything. Well then, designer clothes and luxury apartments are paid for with money. I want to see how you pay for them now." "It is impossible for us to pay this rent, Sarah," Stephen exploded, slamming his palm on the table. "You pulled me off your investment accounts. That annual bonus I got for managing your portfolio was what we used to pay for the trips and the extras. You've cut my legs off at the bank. My boss demanded explanations this morning." "Your boss demanded explanations because you were a terrible financial advisor who only kept his job thanks to my capital," I fired back, not raising my voice but driving every word like a nail into his professional coffin. "For 5 years, I left my money at that branch, accepting mediocre returns, just so you could show off in front of your colleagues and collect your commissions. I subsidized your career, Stephen, and you had the nerve to look down your nose at me at family gatherings?" The arrogant banker vanished before my eyes, shrinking in his chair, humiliated upon realizing that his professional success had been a farce, funded by the old woman he considered ignorant. Valerie began to cry openly, smearing black mascara down her cheeks. "Mom, please don't do this to us. The baby is due in 8 weeks. We already paid the deposit for the maternity suite at St. Joseph's. I have the registry at the European boutique. If you cut off my card, I won't be able to buy the imported sterilizer or the mahogany crib. What are my friends going to say? What are the people in my circle going to think?" The mention of her friends and appearances was the final reminder I needed to confirm I was doing the right thing. I leaned slightly forward and looked her straight in the eyes, identical to her late father's. "Arthur, show them Exhibit B." The lawyer pulled a document from his briefcase and placed it in front of my daughter. It was a notarized copy of the check I had torn up the night of the baby shower. Valerie looked at the paper and her breath caught in her throat. She blinked several times, as if she couldn't comprehend the figure full of zeros printed on the document. $300,000, I said out loud, letting the amount echo off the glass walls of the office. That was the real gift that was in the white envelope next to the alpaca sweaters you threw on the floor. It was the seed money for my grandson's college fund, a A certified check in your name, ready to be deposited. Valerie brought both hands to her mouth, choking back a gasp of shock. Stephen leaned over to see the document, and when his eyes caught the figure, he looked like he couldn't breathe. The greed on his face clashed violently with the reality of his loss. Where is that check, Sarah? Stephen asked, his voice trembling, almost begging. Sarah, with that money, we could buy our own house. We could get out of this mess. Please. That check is at the bottom of the wastebasket in my study, torn into 8 pieces. I replied with a glacial smile that didn't reach my eyes. I tore it up the moment I realized my daughter preferred to humiliate her mother in front of 50 strangers to win the approval of empty women. You saw a craft paper wrapping, Valerie, and you assumed it was trash. You were so blinded by your hunger to show off that you threw your own son's future in the garbage. Valerie dropped her head onto the glass table and began to sob with a deep, loud desperation. It wasn't the manipulative crying of a spoiled brat who had her toy taken away. It was the visceral weeping of someone who had just watched her entire world collapse due to her own stupidity. She realized the magnitude of what she had destroyed. She realized that the abyss she was falling into had been dug with her own hands and her own prejudices. Stephen looked at her with a mix of fury and resentment. The fragile balance of their marriage, built on a foundation of free money and fake status, was fracturing right in front of us. Without my checkbook to maintain the illusion, they had nothing left but blame. I leaned back in my chair and adjusted the cuffs of my blazer. The revelation had taken effect. It was time to dictate the terms of their new reality. From this moment on, things are going to work as follows, I announced. They both looked up immediately, like scolded dogs waiting for a command. All my assets, my commercial properties, my real estate, and my bank accounts have been transferred into a blind trust. Arthur and his firm are the sole administrators. I am the sole living beneficiary. You are not mentioned in a single clause. Valerie tried to speak, but her voice failed her. You have exactly 30 days to sign the new lease agreement and pay the first month's rent for the Diamond Tower, along with the past due HOA fees. If you cannot pay it or do not want to, you have exactly the same amount of time to pack up your designer things and vacate my property. Arthur will begin the eviction process on the 31st, first thing in the morning. We have nowhere to go, Stephen whispered, defeated, running his hands through his messy hair. I won't get approved for a mortgage with my current debt. Look for a 2-bedroom apartment in the suburbs, I suggested indifferently. Millions of honest families live like that and raise wonderful children. As for the maternity clinic, I suggest you cancel that VIP suite and demand a refund. Valerie Stephen has medical insurance as a bank employee. You will have to give birth at the hospital assigned by the policy. You will probably share a room just like I did when you were born. My friends are going to see me. Valerie mumbled, a reflex of her old vanity, though the sentence lacked any force. If they are truly your friends, they will visit you in any hospital. If they aren't, you just saved yourself a lot of money on coffees and French macarons, I replied, cutting off her complaint at the root. There will be no credit card extensions. There will be no emergency loans. There will be no tuition payments in the future. As of today, you are the architects of your own financial destiny. I stood up, slowly smoothing the skirt of my suit. Valerie and Stephen remained seated, paralyzed by the weight of the consequences. There was no trace left of the arrogant daughter who demanded perfection from me, nor of the smug son-in-law who thought he owned the world. All that was left were 2 scared adults, finally forced to grow up all at once. One last thing, I said, placing both hands on the glass table and looking at them with a severity that allowed no argument. When my grandson is born, I will go meet him. And when I do, I will bring the exact same 3 alpaca wool sweaters that I knitted with my own hands. You both better make sure that when I walk through that door, the boy is wearing one of them. If I see a single European brand logo on that baby the day I meet him, I assure you that you won't even inherit the buttons from my old haberdashery. Without waiting for an answer, I grabbed my purse, gave Arthur a slight nod of gratitude, and walked toward the exit. I opened the glass office door and stepped out into the carpeted hallway of the firm. I didn't look back. While waiting for the elevator, I felt an extraordinary lightness in my chest. I had spent 40 years carrying the weight of an absurd guilt, trying to compensate my daughter for the hardships of my youth, building her a throne that ended up turning her into a tyrant. But the throne had been dismantled. The glass floor they danced on had shattered into pieces, and for the first time in their lives, they would have to learn to walk on hard, honest earth. It is fascinating to watch how quickly arrogance dissolves when the first bill you can't pay arrives. The 30-day deadline I gave them in Arthur's office passed for me like a soft spring breeze, full of tranquility and mornings drinking coffee in the garden. But for Valerie and Stephen, that month was a Category 5 hurricane that leveled their house of cards. Through my lawyer's punctual reports, I learned the details of their fall into the real world. Stephen tried to apply for a personal loan at his own bank to cover the rent at the Diamond Tower and keep up appearances, but his debt-to-income ratio, thanks to the luxury watches, the financed trips to Europe, and the loan on his late-model German car, caused the system to automatically reject him. Without the backing of my investment accounts, which previously served as invisible collateral for their whims, my son-in-law discovered that his signature was worthless. They had to move. I didn't go watch them pack, nor did I stop by the building to supervise the move. I stayed in my colonial house, pruning my ferns and listening to classical music on my old transistor radio. Arthur informed me they had rented a 2-bedroom apartment in a middle-class neighborhood. A decent place, but with a shared laundry room, no Carrara marble floors, and no uniformed security guards opening the glass doors. Exactly the kind of place they needed to live in for their feet to touch the ground again. The most revealing part of their descent, I learned later, was the deafening silence from their social circle. The exact same friends of Valerie's who had squealed with excitement over the Italian coats at the baby shower suddenly had full schedules when my daughter needed help boxing up her porcelain dinnerware. No one went to visit her in her new zip code. The status they had bought with my money was a rented illusion, and the moment the cash flow was cut off, the audience abandoned the theater. While they were learning to make a grocery budget, I experienced an absolute rebirth. I realized I had spent the last decade holding my breath, trying to make myself small to fit into the invisible corner my daughter had designated for me. Freed from the burden of funding her vanity, my energy returned with a force I thought I had lost in my youth. I pulled my old accounting ledgers from the golden scissor out of the back of my closet. I reviewed my numbers, spoke with Arthur, and decided to use a portion of the returns from my commercial properties for something truly useful. In less than a couple of weeks, I began the paperwork to open a community center in a neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. I hired teachers and bought industrial sewing machines. I was going to teach young women, many of them single mothers, how to knit, embroider, do tailoring, alterations, and above all, how to manage a small business. My money was no longer going to sponsor French macarons or imperial mint balloons. It was going to sponsor the independence of women who, like me during my widowhood, needed to learn that the power to change their destiny rested in their own hands. My life filled with a vibrant purpose. I no longer sat by the phone waiting for Valerie to call and ask for a favor disguised as a visit. I had my own meetings, my own projects, and a peace of mind I wouldn't trade for all the gold in the world. The climax of this transformation arrived almost 2 months after that meeting in the office. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, when my cell phone broke the silence of my bedroom. Seeing Stephen's name on the screen, I knew immediately what it was about. I answered on the 3rd ring, turning on my bedside lamp. Sarah. My son-in-law's voice sounded hoarse, his words dragging with a deep, genuine exhaustion. Matthew was born. He was born half an hour ago. How are they both? I asked, keeping a serene tone, though my grandmother's heart inevitably skipped a beat with joy. They're good. Valerie is very tired. The labor was long, but the boy is perfect. He weighed 7.5 pounds. We're at County General, the one covered by the bank's policy. I will be there first thing in the morning. That was all I said before hanging up. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I got up, took a hot shower, and got ready with meticulous care. I chose a sand-colored tailored suit, sober but elegant, comfortable shoes, and pinned my silver stork brooch to my left lapel. I went to the dining room, picked up the cardboard box wrapped in craft paper that I had jealously guarded since the day of the baby shower, and went out to the street to hail a cab. County General was a world, diametrically opposed to the St. Joseph private clinic where Valerie had originally planned to give birth. Here, there was no valet parking service, no lobby with gleaming floors and ambient music. There were crowded hallways, a pungent smell of bleach and rubbing alcohol, nurses running back and forth with charts under their arms, and the constant echo of newborns crying and entire families murmuring while waiting for news. I navigated the corridors following the receptionist's directions until I reached the maternity ward. The room assigned to my daughter was number 214. I pushed open the heavy, chipped wooden door. It was a shared room, 2 hospital beds separated only by a pale green fabric curtain. In the bed by the window, another young woman was nursing her baby. In the bed closest to the door was Valerie. I stood in the doorway for a moment, observing the scene. There were no exotic floral arrangements or metallic balloons welcoming the air. Stephen was asleep, hunched over in a rigid plastic chair in the corner, his tie loosened and his shirt wrinkled. Valerie was awake, resting against the thin hospital pillows. She was pale, her hair messy, her face devoid of any trace of makeup. Dark circles under her eyes marked a violent contrast with the skin on her cheekbones. But what struck me most wasn't her physical appearance. It was the way she held the tiny bundle resting on her chest. She hugged him with a mix of reverential terror and absolute love. I took a step inside, and the soft click of my heels on the linoleum made Valerie look up. Seeing me, her eyes instantly filled with tears. She didn't look away, nor did she try to fix her posture. I walked slowly until I was standing next to her bed. I looked down at my grandson. He was tiny, with flushed skin and a tuft of dark hair peeking over his forehead. He was fast asleep, oblivious to the financial and family drama that had preceded his arrival. And then I saw it. Matthew wasn't wearing a onesie with a European fashion house logo. He wasn't wrapped in imported silk blankets. He was wearing the seafoam green sweater knitted with alpaca wool. It was a little big on him, but the soft texture of the yarn adapted perfectly to his fragile little body, wrapping him in a warm embrace that only my hands knew how to build. Valerie noticed where my gaze had landed. She stroked the sleeve of her son's sweater with a trembling finger. "It's the only thing that didn't irritate his skin, Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking, afraid to speak too loudly and wake the baby or her roommate. We tried putting on the little outfit I bought at the boutique, but the fabric was too stiff. The seams scratched his little neck as soon as the nurses put it on him. He cried so much. I stayed silent, letting her own words finish dismantling the armor of superficiality she had worn for so long. "Stephen brought the sweaters in the hospital bag," Valerie continued, and a thick tear rolled down her left cheek. "When we put it on him, he calmed down immediately. It's so soft. It's so warm." I placed the cardboard box I had brought with me on the small metal nightstand. Inside were the other 2 sweaters, the white and the yellow washed and ironed again. "Baby alpaca has hypoallergenic properties, Valerie. I told you that at the event hall, but you were too busy listening to the applause of people who don't care about you in the slightest," I replied without cruelty, but with the firmness of an undeniable fact. Valerie closed her eyes and nodded, swallowing hard. "None of my friends have come," she confessed in a thread of a voice. "I let them know at dawn. They told me the hospital was too far away, that the neighborhood wasn't safe for their SUVs, that they'd rather visit me when I was back home. Only my mother-in-law sent a text message. 'We are completely alone, Mom. You were right about everything. I was stupid, a horrible, empty person. And I ask for your forgiveness. I ask for your forgiveness from the bottom of my soul.'" The sound of her crying woke Stephen, who jolted upright in his plastic chair, disoriented. Seeing me, his posture changed immediately. He stood up, smoothed his shirt nervously, and offered me his chair with a gesture that mixed respect and submission. "Sarah, I'm so glad you're here. Please sit," he said, rubbing his tired eyes. I didn't sit. I stood tall. The absolute matriarch of that small hospital room. I looked at Stephen and then at Valerie. I no longer saw my tormentors, nor 2 tyrants disguised as elite executives. I saw 2 young adults terrified by the responsibility of raising a child, humbled by their own mistakes, and finally ready to learn how to truly live. I raised my hand and with infinite delicacy stroked my grandson's cheek. Matthew's skin was perfect warm against my fingers, marked by wrinkles and years of work. "He is beautiful, sweetheart," I said, feeling a knot untie in my throat, though I maintained my composure. He has your father's nose. Valerie smiled through her tears, clinging to that small moment of connection I was offering her. Mom, are you going to forgive us? She asked, looking at me with fragile hope. I pulled my hand back from the baby's face and adjusted my purse on my shoulder. It was time to deliver the final lesson. If I caved now, if I told them everything was going back to the way it was, the suffering of the last month would have been for nothing. They would go right back to their old ways the second the bank account was full. Forgiveness is one thing, Valerie and finances are something else entirely, I declared with a calm but immovable tone that made Stephen hold his breath. The terms of the trust are not going to change. The credit account will remain canceled, and the lease for your current apartment comes out of your husband's salary. I am not going to hand you back a life of luxury you haven't earned with your own hands. Valerie looked down, but she nodded. There were no tantrums, no complaints. The lesson had sunk into her bones. However, I continued turning toward Stephen. Arthur has instructions to open a savings account exclusively in Matthew's name. Every month, a percentage of the profits from my commercial properties will be deposited there. That money is designated solely for his medical expenses, his schooling, and his college education. You will not be able to touch a single cent of that fund to pay your debts or buy designer clothes. My grandson is not going to suffer for his parents' mistakes, but you are going to have to sweat bullets to put bread on your table every day. Stephen let out a sigh of relief so deep it seemed to take 10 years off him. He looked me in the eyes, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw genuine gratitude instead of arrogance. Thank you, Sarah. I swear to you, we are going to pull through. I asked for a transfer at the bank to a risk analyst position. It pays fewer commissions, but the base salary is fixed, and I'll be able to leave on time to be with them. We are going to learn to live on what we make. You better, I replied, flashing a small, ironic smile. Because if I ever see a $1,000 Italian onesie on this child while you two are eating instant noodles, I will personally file for custody. Valerie let out a small laugh. A weak but honest laugh, freed from the crushing weight of having to fake perfection. I stayed with them for another hour. We talked about how to care for the umbilical cord feeding schedules and how to burp the baby after he ate. I was the mother and grandmother I always wanted to be, but this time on my own terms, demanding the respect I deserved. When I said goodbye, I kissed my daughter on the forehead and gave another kiss to my grandson. Walking out the hospital room door and into the bustling hallway, I felt the last chain binding me to my guilt shatter into 1,000 pieces. The cab ride back to my house downtown was the most peaceful of my life. I looked out the window as the city woke up, as shopkeepers rolled up their metal gates, and people walked briskly toward their jobs. I belonged to that world, the world of people who get their hands dirty, who count their coins, and who know exactly how much every brick in their house costs. I had achieved something that money alone could never buy. I had rescued my daughter from herself. By refusing to continue being the rug she walked on, I forced her to stand on her own 2 feet. I arrived home, unlocked the mahogany door, and the damp, earthy scent of my inner courtyard welcomed me back. On the coffee table rested my stork-shaped embroidery scissors, sharp and gleaming. Life, just like a hand-knitted garment, requires patience, the right tension, and knowing exactly when to tie a knot so the whole piece doesn't unravel. Sometimes the greatest demonstration of love a mother can give isn't providing everything, but having the courage to cut the thread, forcing them to knit their own destiny. This powerful story we just shared is created strictly for educational and motivational purposes, serving as a profound reflection on family dynamics, personal boundaries, and the true meaning of wealth. When we listen to Sarah's journey, we are reminded that true wealth does not whisper through designer labels or luxury apartments, but rather it speaks volumes through resilience, honest hard work, and the quiet dignity of a life well lived. The core lesson here is that as parents and loved ones, our ultimate duty isn't to pave a friction-free road lined with endless financial bailouts, but to equip our children with the strength to walk on rough terrain. We often confuse unconditional love with unconditional enabling, unknowingly stripping away the very struggles that build character, gratitude, and self-reliance. Applying this to our daily lives means having the courage to set firm boundaries, even when it breaks our hearts to see our loved ones stumble. It teaches us to value the alpaca sweaters of the world, the heartfelt, time-consuming efforts of others, over the superficial shine of a price tag. If we want to cultivate a better life for ourselves and our families, we must stop wrapping our self-worth in material possessions and start grounding it in accountability and genuine human connection. Sometimes the most profound act of love is allowing someone to face the consequences of their own arrogance so they can rediscover their humility. By cutting the financial cord, Sarah didn't abandon her family. She rescued them from a hollow existence of fake prestige. We can all learn to step back, evaluate where we are over-accommodating in our relationships, and realize that a little tough love today can be the foundation of someone's independence and authentic happiness tomorrow. From my personal perspective, this story beautifully captures the painful yet necessary transition from enabling to empowering. I believe that modern society has tragically conditioned us to measure a person's worth by their external appearances rather than their internal grit. Sarah's stoic reaction to public humiliation is a masterclass in emotional intelligence and self-respect. It hurts deeply to watch someone you love reject your purest efforts, but her response shows that we dictate our own value, not the ungratefulness of others. I see Valerie not as a villain, but as a victim of a culture that glorifies the superficial, blinding her to the priceless sacrifices of her mother. We all have moments where we take the quiet, steady love of our family for granted, assuming it will always be there to catch our falls. The beauty of this narrative lies in the redemption found in a hospital room stripped of all luxury and pretense. It proves that hitting rock bottom is sometimes the only way to look up and see what truly matters. I deeply admire how the mother protected her grandson's future while simultaneously forcing his parents to grow up. It is a humanistic approach to generational wealth, ensuring money serves as a safety net for genuine needs rather than a hammock for laziness. In our own lives, we must strive to be like the hand-knitted sweater, authentic, warm, and created with intention. We must also forgive those who lose their way, just as Sarah did when she met her grandson, balancing stern boundaries with a compassionate heart. True growth requires discomfort, and shielding our loved ones from every hardship ultimately clips their wings. I hope this story inspires listeners to mend fractured relationships, not with money, but with honesty, accountability, and mutual respect. Ultimately, the greatest inheritance we can leave behind is not a bank account, but the resilience to survive and thrive without it. Disclaimer: this content is provided for educational, inspirational, and entertainment purposes only. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are meant to encourage personal reflection and do not constitute professional psychological, financial, family, or legal advice. Listeners should apply these lessons at their own discretion and seek professional guidance for their specific personal situations.